Father, I pray once again that the words of my mouth, the meditations of all of our hearts would be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. There are some questions that we ask that are so distressing, it's difficult to know what to do with them. The kinds of questions that are connected to events like what took place in Nashville and other places like that, and repeated over and over again in our nation and in our world. There are questions the kind of questions that are connected to someone we love that dies too soon, or that tragic accident, or disappointment, or trauma that is so deep it jars us in the very depths of our being. The kind of questions that come to us when we feel the guilt and the shame of our sin and worry if it's too much, too grievous, too often. I suspect that in one way or another we have all encountered these kinds of questions. We wrestle with them, we struggle with them, we anguish over them. And they tend to come to us as some of the most difficult questions of our lives, and they often end up in the most difficult moments of our lives. And so it shouldn't surprise us that as Jesus hangs on the cross, all that he's faced, all that he's enduring, all the reality of the cross, that in this moment, Jesus asks one of these questions. My God, why have you abandoned me? This question of Jesus feels like one of those things that it unsettles us a little bit. That Jesus, the Son of God, would ask a question like that. I mean, we ask questions like that, but surely Jesus doesn't ask questions like that. It rattles us to think that Jesus would ask a question like that. And yet, the theologian Jürgen Moltmann says that any theology which claims to be Christian must come to terms with the cry of Jesus on the cross. Why have you abandoned me? There's something about that question that reaches into the depths of not only who we are, but who God is. As we think about the cross, I think one of the things that we tend to focus our attention on in terms of what Jesus goes through and what Jesus is doing and the sacrifice that Jesus makes, we tend to focus on the blood that Jesus sheds and how that is the way that forgives our sins, and that is certainly a very important part of the cross. And the agony of that and the struggle of that and the burden of that. But I can't help but wonder if perhaps the greatest struggle that Jesus faces on the cross is this sense of feeling abandoned. Abandoned by his Father in heaven. Jesus takes upon himself all the sins of the world. And in order to do that, in order to truly take him on himself the sins of the world, then he must also experience the consequences of those sins. Shame, guilt, and the natural separation between human and God that sin causes. We see this in the Garden of Eden. The first people to reject God, to go their own way, to sin against God. When God shows up, they run and hide. It's a physical image of the separation that they feel in their own spirits about who God is. And sometimes we wonder, what's the biggest problem with sin? About where it leads us. And we often tend to gravitate toward punishment and judgment, and that is certainly a reality. But I can't help but wonder if maybe the greatest, most significant consequence of our sin is that it separates us from our good Creator. It separates us from the source of all that is good and all that is life and all that is love and all that is peace. It separates us. It's just what sin does. And Jesus is experiencing that in a way he's never known before. I sometimes wonder if the deepest pain that any human being experiences is the feeling of being forsaken or abandoned. I remember reading years ago about a little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, who desperately wanted to be a part of the neighborhood group. He desperately wanted those other kids to be his friends and him to be their friend, and he tried everything he could think of to try to get into the group, and nothing worked. They just kept pushing him away. They didn't want to have anything to do with them. He wasn't like them. He didn't fit in. They didn't want him around. As you can imagine, that was painful for him. And one day, one of the kids came to his door and they said, "Hey, we're going to play hide and seek together. You want to play with us?" He couldn't believe it. Never put his shoes on faster. He was out the door with them, and he got into the circle as they decided who was going to seek and who was going to hide. And the person who was chosen to seek put their head on the tree. You know how you do that when you're a child, and you cover your eyes and you start counting. And everybody dispersed to hide in the best place they could find. And this little boy was thinking to himself, I want to prove to them that I'm a good game player so I can be a part of the group. And so he tried to find the best place he could to hide. And he kept thinking to himself, I've finally gotten my in. I'm finally a part of the group. They finally accepted me. This is awesome. And he was so excited, and he's hiding and thinking, they're going to think so highly of me because I found such a great place to hide. No one's going to find me. And what he didn't realize is that they invited him in order to play a trick on him. Because once everybody had hid, all the other kids came out of hiding back to the one counting and took off. And they left that little boy in his hiding place, waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, until eventually he wondered what was going on, and he came out and discovered what had happened, what they had done. I don't know that little boy, but you can only imagine how that affected his life. That kind of abandonment, that kind of rejection gets into our psyche and who we are. I suspect he may have wrestled the rest of his life with trusting people. And as Jesus hangs on the cross, he is going through something even worse, because he feels abandoned by God. He has never experienced that before. Throughout his eternal existence, he and the Father have had this inseparable, loving intimacy with one another. We get a glimpse of it as we read through the Gospels. And Matthew 3 tells us that as soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water, and at that moment heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I'm well pleased." And Jesus describes their relationship in John's Gospel. "I and the Father are one. If you keep my commandments, you'll abide in my love, just as I've kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you." And then he says, "Father, you have loved me before the creation of the world." And now all of that seems to be a distant reality in the abandonment that Jesus feels. No wonder the words of David from Psalm 22 come to his mind in this moment. As he cries out the opening words that David wrote years before, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest." I don't think that Jesus, in his mind, believes that God has abandoned him. But I do believe that what Jesus is experiencing makes him wonder, and he feels as if he's abandoned. There are a lot of times where we have things in our minds that we know are true, and we figured things out, but they end up being different from our experience. And we tend to live in our experiences. I would guess that we've been through the experience before, if you have children, before you had children, and if you haven't, maybe you've had this experience, where you look at someone someone's children, and you look at them, maybe you're in the supermarket, and you think to yourself, man, if I were their parent, I wouldn't let them do that. When I have children, that's not going to happen. And then you bring home that bundle of joy, and you realize as you're driving home, I don't have a clue what it means to be a parent. And then as a toddler, they start moving around your house, and you realize, I still don't have a clue about being a parent. And they go to the first day of school, and you're thinking, I don't know what it means to be a parent. And then they enter adolescence, and you realize you really don't have any clue what it means to be a parent. And then you drop them off at college, or at that they go to their first job, or maybe they're moving away. And you realize all along, this whole parenting thing has been a journey of, I'm hoping I'm doing the best that I think is right. What we thought we knew, what we experienced, not always the same things. And as Jesus hangs on the cross, I think in his mind he knows the Father would never abandon him, but the overwhelming nature of what he's experiencing is making him wonder, feel it, struggle. Perhaps the writer of Hebrews has something of this in mind when he says we don't have a high priest who's unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who's been tempted in every way just as we are, yet he did not sin. Can't help but wonder if the greatest temptation that Jesus faces is to really believe that God has abandoned him. What a horrific thing for the evil one to put on him. Yes, God has abandoned you. I mean, that's the temptation of the evil one. It's his greatest temptation. God will desert you. That sin is too much. Look at what's happened to you in this world, this life. Look at the tragedy and the disappointment. God has abandoned you. God doesn't care about you. You can't trust God. That's the temptation that the evil one puts on Adam and Eve. You don't really believe God, do you? You can't really trust God to come through for you. It's the essence of every temptation that we face. You can't trust God. And the hard part about this is that we only get one side of the conversation. We have no idea how God responds to Jesus. All we get is silence. And silence has a way of communicating abandonment. And we don't get an answer from God to Jesus' question. We don't get one answer from God about Jesus' question, just nothing but silence. Jesus goes to the grave, silence. We read this story, silence. God doesn't answer Jesus' question. Until Sunday. And on Sunday, God answers his question. And it's a pretty good answer, right? I find it fascinating that the writers of the New Testament, when they describe the resurrection, rarely do they say Jesus rose from the dead. What they tell us is that God raised Jesus from the dead. What's God's answer to Jesus' question? Resurrection. And what's God's answer to your questions and my questions that sometimes feels like all we're getting from God is silence? It's resurrection. The reality of our disappointments and our struggles and the feelings of guilt and shame and the feelings of abandonment and the concern about God abandoning us, sometimes in the world in which we live, we don't get the answer we want. Because the ultimate answer is resurrection. God is merciful and gracious, and there are times where he steps into this world and he gives us what we're hoping for and looking for in this world. And we give him thanks for that and his mercy and his compassion. But the ultimate proof that God is who he says he is, that God is faithful, is the resurrection. You read through the book of Hebrews and you get to chapter 11, and the writer of Hebrews gives us this litany of all of these people who have suffered and struggled and died and gone through horrific things because they follow Jesus. And the writer of Hebrews says they didn't get to hear from God what they were praying for until resurrection. And that's how we know that God is faithful. And the call on us is to trust, which I think is exactly what Jesus does, because the last words from the cross are not, my God, why have you abandoned me?" The last words from the cross are, "Father, into your hands I commit myself. I trust you. Trust you. I believe, in spite of what I feel, that you are faithful." I wonder if one of the reasons Jesus thinks about Psalm 22 is not just the opening words. You know, the Psalms are basically the hymn book of the Jews. And every Jewish person from a little child is taught the hymn book. They sing in the temple. They sing in the synagogue. They know these songs, and they sing them all the time. And you know how it is with music. Music gets into you. We remember music far more than we do just words. We're walking along and a tune pops into our head, a song pops into our minds, and we remember it. And as someone said to me recently, often if you know the song well enough, all it takes is the first phrase and you think about the whole song. Your mind just goes with it. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. Exactly, see? Jesus loves me, this I know. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Yeah. I mean, the whole thing comes back to us. I can't help but wonder if as Jesus cries out with this question, he also realizes that all of the Jews standing around him are going to remember not just those words, but the rest of the psalm too. And the rest of the psalm has things like verses 3 to 5, yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. In you our ancestors put their trust. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. And verse 22, I will declare your name to my people. In the assembly I will praise you. And I always thought that the Psalms were just random songs, random psalms that where somebody said, well, let's just throw them together and we'll get 150 of them. But scholars tell us that there's purpose and there's structure to the Psalms. Which then intrigues me to think that Psalm 22 begins, my God, why have you abandoned me? And the next psalm begins, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That is faith and trust in the faithfulness of God. The heart of our faith comes back to this, because if God abandons Jesus, then you and I are lost without hope. And the very foundations of everything that we believe are a facade. Lloyd Douglas was a well-known pastor and author earlier part of the 20th century. Some of you might be aware of the best-selling novel he wrote, The Robe. He says he had a friend that he loved to visit on a regular basis. This man was a violin teacher, worked out of a studio where he was surrounded by other musicians. He said, I'd love to visit him because he always had something encouraging and refreshing to say to me. So I went to visit him one day and walked in and I said, what's the good word today? And the man put down his violin and he walked over, picked up a tuning fork, probably something like this. And he tapped it and he said, that's the good news today. He said, that, my friend, is middle C. It was middle C yesterday. It'll be middle C tomorrow. It'll be middle C a week from now. It'll be middle C in 1,000 years. He said the soprano upstairs warbles. The tenor down the hall flats his high notes. The piano across the hall is out of tune. All around me is noise. But that, my friend, is middle C. And I want to tell us today that the faithfulness of God is middle C. It has always been, and it will always be. It is the nature and the essence and the character of God that we count on, that we trust in. In the darkest moments, in the moments when we get answers that we want, in the moments when we don't get answers that we want, our faith rests on the truth that God is eternally faithful, and we can trust Him. We're going to spend some time praying together, and as we've been doing the last few weeks, if you would like to offer your prayers, let me invite you to come join me at the altar rail. Maybe you want to pray for yourself, maybe you want to pray for others, pray for things in the world. If you'd like to join me at the altar rail in this time of prayer, please come.